very quickly. Can you go into what you just talked about at the NATO meeting?
Well, we have a concept of a deal. I think it's going to be a very good deal for the United States, also for them. And we're going to work together on something having to do with the Arctic as a whole, but also Greenland, and it has to do with the security, great security, strong security, and other things.
By the time Donald Trump stepped onto the stage in Davos, the damage was already moving faster than any statement could contain. Markets had shifted, governments were reacting, and a claim tied to Greenland was being treated as a turning point with real financial consequences. What followed was not a single misstep, but a chain reaction that exposed how quickly a presidential decision can outrun the systems meant to absorb it. According to public reporting, institutions were forced to respond before basic facts were settled, locking in losses and diplomatic strain. This moment matters because once credibility collapses at that level, control narrows sharply. From here, there is no clean reset, only consequences unfolding in sequence. What followed Trump's public framing was not clarification, but acceleration. According to public reporting, the absence of released documents created a vacuum that was immediately filled by speculation, selective leaks, and increasingly rigid positions. Each hour that passed without formal text hardened assumptions on all sides. Markets moved as if confirmation were inevitable, while diplomats prepared rebuttals they had hoped to avoid. The timeline compressed quickly. In the days after Davos, references to Greenland shifted from abstract strategy to implied execution. Greenland Resources Corp was repeatedly cited in media coverage and market commentary, treated as a proxy for presidential intent rather than a company awaiting verification. Prices reacted first, explanations later. This sequence mattered. Once capital is committed, incentives change. Participants stop asking whether a claim is accurate and start asking whether they can exit before someone else does. Documents became the next pressure point. According to statements from Danish officials, the agreement being discussed publicly did not match what had been signed privately. That gap widened as denials circulated, but denials moved slower than headlines. In financial systems, delay is interpreted as weakness. In diplomatic systems, delay is interpreted as escalation. Trump's team appeared to assume that momentum would outrun contradiction. Instead, contradiction multiplied. High-attention moments stacked rapidly. Trading volumes spiked without corresponding disclosures. Government spokespeople issued carefully worded statements that stopped short of endorsement. Regulatory agencies remained publicly silent, which markets read as uncertainty rather than reassurance. Each signal reinforced the next, creating a feedback loop that was no longer under central control. From an analytical standpoint, this is where the decision-making failure became structural. Trump's approach relied on a belief that ambiguity could be managed long enough to produce a favorable outcome. But ambiguity behaves differently once institutions are forced to act. Investors demand exits, governments demand clarity, regulators begin logging timelines. The room for narrative maneuver shrinks with every transaction recorded. The adversarial frame here is unavoidable. Trump's escalation strategy depended on speed, but speed also exposed him to actors with fixed procedures and legal obligations. Markets can pause, regulators do not forget, diplomats may delay, records do not erase. The assumption that authority could keep these systems aligned underestimated how quickly they diverge when interests conflict. A personal assessment is necessary at this point. I see this phase not as a misunderstanding, but as a gamble on time. The bet was that confirmation would arrive before scrutiny. Instead, scrutiny arrived first, and confirmation did not. Escalation works only while systems agree to move together. By the end of this phase, the situation had shifted from messaging risk to institutional exposure, setting the stage for consequences that no statement could reverse. By the time the consequences became visible, the process was already out of Trump's control. What had begun as a declarative move hardened into an operational crisis across multiple sectors, each responding on its own timetable. According to public reporting, the first wave of impact did not arrive as a single shock, but as overlapping pressures that reinforced one another faster than any centralized response could coordinate. The financial sector moved first. Trading desks reacted not to clarification, but to exposure. Positions tied to Greenland Resources Corp were now embedded across portfolios that had assumed presidential signaling carried implicit backing. When denials and contradictions began circulating, liquidity tightened, bid spreads widened, exit windows narrowed. This was not panic yet, but it was stress, and stress changes behavior. Once traders sense that a narrative may not survive the next news cycle, they stop optimizing for gains and start racing to limit losses. Almost simultaneously, regulatory attention began to surface. According to statements from enforcement officials, market activity around Arctic-linked securities triggered internal monitoring thresholds. This is a mechanical process, not a political one. Volume spikes, correlated timing, and narrative catalysts are logged automatically. At that point, intent becomes secondary to documentation. Emails, transaction records, and timestamps start to matter more than explanations. In my judgment, this is where the situation crossed, from reputational risk into procedural risk. A second sector felt the strain at the same time: diplomacy. Danish officials, now facing global headlines, were compelled to restate their position publicly. According to official documents, the memorandum being referenced did not grant sovereignty, exclusivity, or mining rights. This clarification was not new, but it was now amplified by the scale of the market reaction. European partners took note. Silence was no longer an option, because silence had begun to look like acquiescence. Here is where the viewer needs to be placed inside the scene. Imagine a trading floor where screens flash contradictory headlines within minutes. Imagine a foreign ministry drafting statements while watching markets move in real time. Imagine regulators logging anomalies as public claims continue unchecked. These are not abstract processes. They are rooms filled with people following rules that do not bend for political messaging. Time pressure intensified. Within hours, capital that had flowed in rapidly began searching for exits. Settlement cycles locked in transactions that could not be reversed. According to public reporting, some funds faced margin stress tied to broader positions, including exposure to the yen carry trade following moves by the Bank of Japan. This matters because it explains urgency. Liquidity needs do not wait for clarification. They force action. The third sector now entered the frame: international finance. As the yen shifted and bond markets repriced, interconnected positions came under review. According to statements from financial analysts, leverage amplifies timing risk. When rates move, collateral calls follow. In this environment, any asset inflated by narrative rather than fundamentals becomes vulnerable. The Greenland-linked surge was suddenly exposed to forces far beyond its original premise. High-attention moments stacked quickly. Trading halts were discussed. Diplomatic statements hardened. Media coverage pivoted from opportunity to contradiction. Each development shortened the timeline for any corrective action. Trump's earlier assumption appeared to be that authority could slow this process. The reality was the opposite. Authority accelerated it by concentrating attention. The adversarial framing becomes clear here. Trump's decision-making treated systems as linear and responsive. In practice, they are layered and autonomous. Financial markets do not wait for diplomats. Regulators do not pause for political convenience. Foreign governments do not coordinate messaging to protect someone else's narrative. Once activated, these systems generate momentum that resists control. A personal analytical observation is unavoidable. This was the moment when the corridor narrowed to a point of no return. Even if full clarification had arrived immediately, it would not have undone trades already settled, statements already issued, or investigations already logged. The cost of reversal now exceeded the cost of escalation, and that is the most dangerous position any leader can occupy. More pressures converged. According to public reporting, attention turned to ownership structures behind Greenland Resources Corp. Shell entities, offshore registrations, and beneficial ownership questions entered public discussion. Again, this is not speculation driving outcomes. It is procedure. When unusual gains align with political catalysts, compliance frameworks require follow-up. Each inquiry generates records that cannot be unseen. Another viewer in the scene moment matters here. Picture compliance officers reconstructing timelines minute by minute. Picture diplomats fielding calls they cannot deflect. Picture political advisors realizing that messaging no longer influences the sequence of events. Control has shifted. The system is now asking questions, not receiving answers. The media sector responded next. Coverage diversified and narratives fragmented. Some outlets emphasized market volatility. Others focused on diplomatic fallout. According to statements from network executives, legal exposure became a consideration. Amplifying unverified claims carries liability once consequences materialize. As coverage adjusted, Trump's ability to unify the narrative diminished further. When multiple systems engage simultaneously, authority becomes reactive. The final pressure in this phase came from time itself. Regulatory processes do not conclude quickly, but they begin quickly. Diplomatic trust does not collapse overnight, but it erodes immediately once contradictions are public. Market losses do not distribute evenly, but they crystallize at settlement. Each of these timelines overlapped, compressing what might have unfolded over months into days. At this point, Trump faced a narrowing set of options, none of them clean. Doubling down risked deeper institutional response. Retreat risked confirming misrepresentation. Silence allowed others to define the record. According to public reporting, this is when attention shifted from the claim itself to the consequences of having made it. High attention sentences belong here because this is where the story turns. The system was no longer debating whether the Greenland Initiative was real. It was managing the damage created by treating it as if it were. That distinction matters. Reality had been replaced by exposure. The adversarial conclusion of this phase is stark. Trump's decision did not fail because of opposition. It failed because it activated mechanisms that do not negotiate. Markets cleared, regulators logged, governments recorded. The outcome was no longer about intent, but about impact. As this phase closed, the feeling was not collapse, but something more dangerous. It was fragile, a structure still standing, but unable to absorb another shock. From here forward, every development would compound rather than correct, and the margin for control would shrink with each passing day. Once the immediate surge passed, institutions began doing what they always do after stress events. They remembered. According to public reporting, the Greenland episode was logged not as an isolated controversy, but as a reference case. In regulatory agencies, timelines were fixed. In diplomatic services, cables were archived. In markets, models were adjusted. These memories matter because they change how future claims are received, regardless of who makes them. Risk repricing followed. Assets associated with political signaling were no longer treated as neutral carriers of intent. They were discounted for credibility risk. According to statements from financial analysts, this kind of repricing is subtle but durable. It does not announce itself. It simply raises the cost of capital and lowers the benefit of doubt. The effect is cumulative. One episode becomes a coefficient applied to the next. Here is the institutional shift that often goes unnoticed. Officials do not argue about narratives after the fact. They adjust procedures. Additional verification steps are added. Clearances slow. Informal channels close. What had once moved quickly now requires documentation. In my assessment, this is the quiet consequence Trump underestimated. Systems respond to stress by becoming less flexible, not more forgiving. High attention signals continued to surface. Diplomatic statements referenced clarity and process with unusual emphasis. Market commentary shifted from opportunity to governance. Legal discussions focused on jurisdiction and record-keeping rather than intent. Each signal pointed in the same direction. The operating environment had changed. The adversarial framing is not about blame, but about effect. Trump's approach trained institutions to assume higher downside from ambiguity. That assumption persists even after headlines fade. The danger is not collapse. The danger is fragility. This fragility shows up in practical ways. Future negotiations face skepticism earlier. Markets demand confirmation sooner. Allies hedge communications rather than align them. According to public reporting, none of these moves are coordinated. They do not need to be. They emerge from shared incentives shaped by recent experience. A personal analytical line belongs here. I see this phase as the moment when optionality truly narrowed. Trump still had access to platforms and authority, but the elasticity was gone. Every move now carried a memory attached to it. That is a heavy constraint for any decision maker. Institutions adapt by remembering risk, not rhetoric. The forward pressure is clear. Fragile systems can function for long periods, but they fail under repeated stress. With each subsequent development, tolerance shrinks and response times shorten. What comes next will be shaped less by what is said and more by what has already been recorded. As the situation moved out of its most volatile phase, the tone shifted from escalation to management. According to public reporting, institutions stopped reacting minute by minute and began preparing for longer processes. This did not mean relief. It meant containment. Systems rarely announce when they are done gathering information, but their behavior changes once the initial shock has been absorbed. De-escalation took a specific form. Public statements became narrower. Legal language replaced political language. Diplomatic channels emphasized procedure over posture. Markets stabilized at new levels that reflected adjusted expectations rather than optimism. None of this restored what had been lost, but it defined a floor. In my assessment, this was the beginning of a controlled landing, not a recovery. There are signals worth watching from here. First, regulatory pacing. When inquiries move from monitoring to formal requests, timelines stretch and discretion tightens. Second, diplomatic sequencing. The order in which clarifications are issued and acknowledged reveals where trust has thinned most. Third, financial behavior. Sustained avoidance of assets linked to political signaling indicates that repricing has become structural. High-attention moments still matter, but they look different now. The absence of amplification can be as revealing as its presence. Silence from institutions often signals that processes are underway rather than resolved. This is where patience becomes more important than reaction. A personal analytical perspective closes this arc. I do not see this episode ending with a single decisive moment. I see it settling into record, precedent, and constraint. Those are quieter outcomes, but they shape future decisions more reliably than headlines ever could. Power recedes not in collapse, but in accumulated limitation. For viewers tracking this story, the professional response is to stay focused on verified developments and procedural signals rather than rhetoric. If you want to continue following how institutional pressure evolves and how decision corridors narrow over time, consider subscribing for further analysis grounded in documented events and measured interpretation.